He was the perfect picture of success, an accomplished CEO raised under the strict rules of discipline and control. But behind the polished exterior was a man who had never known love. His life was a carefully constructed routine, until she walked in. Bold, fearless, and unlike anyone he had ever met, this woman shattered his walls and turned his world upside down. What happens when a man bound by rules meets someone who refuses to follow them? Stay tuned to uncover the story of love, courage, and breaking free from the chains of the past. Julian Carter was the epitome of success. At just 30 years old, he had built one of New York's most prestigious architectural firms, renowned for designing iconic structures that redefined the city's skyline. His life was a carefully constructed masterpiece, much like the buildings he created, precise, controlled, and flawless. But beneath the polished exterior lay a man burdened by the weight of expectations. Julian's father, Richard Carter, a legendary architect himself, had instilled in him a relentless drive for perfection. For Julian, failure was not an option, and emotions were a distraction he couldn't afford. This rigid mindset had left him isolated, with no room for love or vulnerability. Enter Amanda Bennett, a 28-year-old freelance journalist with a sharp mind and an insatiable curiosity for uncovering hidden stories. Having recently moved to New York to chase bigger opportunities, Amanda was determined to make her mark. Her resilience and wit were shaped by a past filled with challenges, but she never let her scars define her. Amanda's passion for storytelling brought her to Julian's office, where she hoped to write a feature on his groundbreaking architectural designs. Their first meeting was anything but smooth. Julian, ever the perfectionist, was guarded and dismissive, viewing Amanda's probing questions as an intrusion into his meticulously curated world. Amanda, however, was undeterred. Her boldness and authenticity left a lasting impression on Julian, even if he wouldn't admit it. For Amanda, Julian was a puzzle she couldn't resist solving, a man whose brilliance was matched only by the walls he had built around himself. Little did they know, this seemingly ordinary interview would set the stage for a journey that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, ambition, and the courage to break free. Julian Carter had always prided himself on control. His life was a series of meticulously planned steps, each one designed to ensure success. But Amanda Bennett was the kind of person who thrived in chaos, and her presence in his life was already beginning to disrupt the carefully constructed order he had worked so hard to maintain. Their first meeting had been brief but impactful, leaving Julian intrigued and Amanda determined to uncover the man behind the stoic exterior. Neither of them expected their paths to cross again so soon. Amanda's editor had assigned her to cover a major architectural project in Chicago, one that Julian's firm was spearheading. The project, a state-of-the-art cultural center, was being hailed as a potential game-changer for the city, blending modern design with historical elements. Amanda, eager to prove herself, jumped at the opportunity. What she didn't anticipate was finding Julian on the same flight, seated just a few rows ahead of her. Amanda spotted Julian as she boarded the plane. He was seated in first class, his laptop open, his expression focused and unreadable. She hesitated for a moment, debating whether to approach him, but decided against it. Instead, she settled into her seat in economy, pulling out her notebook to prepare for the article. Fate, however, had other plans. A last-minute seating shuffle due to an overbooked flight landed Amanda in the seat next to Julian. He looked up, surprised but composed, as she slid into the seat beside him. "Well, this is unexpected," Amanda said with a grin, breaking the silence. Julian raised an eyebrow. "I could say the same. Are you following me, Miss Bennett?" Amanda laughed, her tone light. "Don't flatter yourself, Mr. Carter. I'm here for the story, not for you." Despite his initial reluctance, Julian found himself drawn into conversation. Amanda's curiosity was infectious, and her questions, though probing, were thoughtful and insightful. For the first time in a long while, Julian felt himself letting his guard down, if only slightly. Their conversation ranged from architecture to Amanda's experiences as a journalist. She shared stories of her travels, the people she had met, and the challenges she had faced in her career. Julian listened intently, surprised by how much he enjoyed her company. By the time the plane landed, the tension between them had softened, replaced by a tentative sense of camaraderie. When they arrived in Chicago, Amanda was invited to join Julian and his team for a tour of the construction site. The cultural center was an ambitious project, blending modern design with elements inspired by the city's rich history. Amanda was immediately struck by the scale and complexity of the project. As they walked through the site, Amanda noticed a different side of Julian. He was in his element here, confident, articulate, and deeply invested in every detail. He spoke with passion about the design, explaining how each element was carefully chosen to reflect the city's identity. "This is incredible," Amanda said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "You've managed to create something that feels both modern and timeless." Julian glanced at her, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "That's the goal. Architecture should tell a story, just like your articles." Amanda was about to respond when a commotion broke out nearby. A minor issue with the foundation design had caused a delay, and tensions were running high among the engineers and construction crew. Julian stepped in immediately, his calm authority diffusing the situation. Amanda watched as he navigated the conflict with ease, offering solutions and reassuring the team. It was clear that he commanded respect, not just because of his position, but because of the way he treated those around him. "You're good at this," Amanda said later, as they stood on the edge of the site watching the sunset over the city. Julian glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "It's what I do?" "No," Amanda said, shaking her head. "I mean, you're good at leading, at making people believe in your vision." For a moment, Julian didn't respond. He looked out at the skyline, his expression unreadable. "It's not always easy," he admitted. "There's a lot of pressure to get it right, to live up to expectations." Amanda sensed there was more he wasn't saying, but she didn't push. Instead, she simply said, "For what it's worth, I think you're doing a pretty good job." That evening, Julian invited Amanda to dinner at a local restaurant known for its unique take on classic Chicago cuisine. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the formal settings Julian was accustomed to. Over dinner, their conversation shifted from work to more personal topics. Julian, though initially hesitant, found himself opening up about his childhood and the immense pressure his father had placed on him. "My father is a legend in the architectural world," Julian said, his tone tinged with both pride and frustration. "Everything I do is compared to him. It's like I'm constantly trying to prove that I'm worthy of the Carter name." Amanda listened intently, her gaze steady. "That sounds exhausting," she said softly. "It is," Julian admitted. "But it's all I've ever known. Success, perfection, it's what's expected of me." Amanda hesitated for a moment before asking, "And what do you expect of yourself?" The question caught Julian off guard. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, before finally saying, "I don't know. I've never really thought about it." Amanda smiled gently. "Maybe it's time you did." When they returned to the hotel, Amanda discovered that her room had a maintenance issue, an air conditioning unit that refused to work in the sweltering summer heat. The hotel staff apologized profusely, but couldn't offer a solution until the next day. Julian, ever the gentleman, offered her the extra bed in his suite. Amanda hesitated, but the thought of spending the night in a sauna-like room was far from appealing. Reluctantly, she accepted. That night, as they sat in the living area of Julian's suite, the conversation flowed easily. They talked about everything from their favorite books to their dreams and fears. Julian, for the first time, admitted how lonely his life had become. "People see the success, the awards, the buildings," he said, his voice quiet. "But they don't see what it costs, the sacrifices, the isolation." Amanda reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You don't have to do it alone, Julian," she said. "You're allowed to let people in." Her words struck a chord in him. For so long, Julian had believed that vulnerability was a weakness, something to be avoided at all costs. But with Amanda, it didn't feel like weakness. It felt like freedom. Though nothing romantic happened that night, the connection between them deepened. They fell asleep in separate rooms, but the unspoken understanding they shared lingered in the air. The next morning, as they prepared to leave for the site, Julian found himself reluctant to say goodbye. Amanda, too, felt a pang of sadness at the thought of parting ways. As they boarded the flight back to New York, Julian turned to Amanda and said, "Thank you." "For what?" she asked, surprised. "For reminding me that there's more to life than work," he said simply. Amanda smiled. "Any time, Mr. Carter." The unexpected business trip marked a turning point in their relationship. Julian began to see Amanda not just as a journalist, but as someone who understood him in a way few others did. Amanda, in turn, saw Julian as more than just a brilliant architect. He was a man struggling to find his place in a world that demanded perfection. Their connection was undeniable, but both knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. For Julian, letting Amanda into his life meant challenging everything he had been taught to value. And for Amanda, being with Julian meant navigating a world of expectations and scrutiny she wasn't sure she was ready for. But for the first time, both of them felt that it might just be worth the risk. Julian Carter had always known that his life was built on a delicate balance. Every decision he made, every step he took, was carefully calculated to maintain the image of perfection his father, Richard Carter, had demanded of him. But as his connection with Amanda Bennett deepened, that balance began to shift. For the first time, Julian found himself questioning the life he had built and the sacrifices he had made to sustain it. Amanda, too, was grappling with her own doubts. She had always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to navigate the world on her own terms. But being with Julian meant stepping into a world of scrutiny and expectations she wasn't sure she was ready for. Their relationship, though still unspoken, was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The tension began to build shortly after their return to New York. Julian's father, Richard, had been keeping a close eye on his son's career, and he wasn't pleased with what he saw. To Richard, Julian's growing connection with Amanda was a distraction, one that threatened to derail the carefully laid plans he had for his son's future. During a tense dinner at the Carter family estate, Richard confronted Julian about his priorities. "You've been spending a lot of time with that journalist," Richard said, his tone sharp. "I hope you're not letting her interfere with your work." Julian set down his glass of wine, his jaw tightening. "Amanda isn't interfering with anything. She's a professional and she's doing her job." Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression cold. "You're the CEO of one of the most prestigious architectural firms in the country. You don't have the luxury of distractions, and you certainly don't have time for frivolous relationships." Julian's hands clenched into fists under the table. "Amanda isn't frivolous," he said, his voice low but firm. "She's intelligent, driven, and she understands me in a way no one else does." Richard's eyes narrowed. "You sound like a lovesick teenager, Julian. You have responsibilities to this family, to the company. You can't afford to let your emotions cloud your judgment." The conversation ended in silence, but the tension lingered. For Julian, it was a stark reminder of the expectations that had been placed on him since childhood. For Richard, it was a warning sign that his son was beginning to stray from the path he had so carefully laid out. Meanwhile, Amanda was facing challenges of her own. Her editor had been thrilled with the article she had written about Julian's Chicago project, but the attention it brought came with a price. Suddenly, Amanda found herself thrust into the spotlight, her every move scrutinized by the media. One morning, as she walked into her favorite coffee shop, Amanda was startled to see her face on the cover of a tabloid magazine. The headline read, "Julian Carter's Mystery Woman. Who is Amanda Bennett?" Her stomach churned as she flipped through the pages. The article was filled with speculation about her relationship with Julian, painting her as a gold digger who was using him to advance her career. Amanda slammed the magazine shut, her hands trembling. She had worked hard to build her reputation as a journalist, and now it felt like everything she had achieved was being overshadowed by her connection to Julian. When she arrived at Julian's office later that day, she was still fuming. "Did you see this?" she demanded, tossing the magazine onto his desk. Julian glanced at the cover, his expression darkening. "I'm sorry, Amanda. I didn't think it would get this bad." Amanda crossed her arms, her frustration evident. "This isn't just about me, Julian. It's about us. If we keep this up, it's only going to get worse." Julian stood, his gaze steady. "I'll handle it. I'll talk to the press, make a statement." "No," Amanda interrupted. "That's not the point. The point is, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can be a part of your world." Her words hit Julian like a punch to the gut. He had always known that being with Amanda would come with challenges, but hearing her doubts out loud made them feel all the more real. The situation escalated when a photo of Julian and Amanda surfaced online. The image, taken during their trip to Chicago, showed the two of them sharing a quiet moment at the construction site. Though the photo was innocent, the media spun it into a scandal, accusing Julian of having an inappropriate relationship with a journalist. The backlash was immediate. Investors began to question Julian's judgment, and clients threatened to pull out of projects. Richard, furious, demanded that Julian end his relationship with Amanda and issue a public apology. "You've jeopardized everything we've worked for," Richard said during a heated argument in Julian's office. "Do you have any idea what this could do to the company's reputation?" Julian's temper flared. "This isn't about the company, Dad. This is about you trying to control my life. I'm not a child anymore. I can make my own decisions." Richard's voice was cold. "Then make the right one. End this. Whatever it is you have with her, or you'll lose everything." The pressure became too much for Amanda. She had always been fiercely independent, but the constant scrutiny and judgment were taking a toll on her. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of dealing with reporters and online trolls, she made a decision. When Julian arrived at her apartment that night, she was waiting for him, her expression resolute. "I can't do this anymore, Julian," she said, her voice trembling. Julian's heart sank. "Amanda, please. Don't let them win. Don't let them push you away." Amanda shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It's not just about them. It's about us. I don't belong in your world, Julian, and you don't deserve to have your life torn apart because of me." Julian reached for her, but she stepped back. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "but this is goodbye." As she closed the door behind him, Julian felt a sense of loss unlike anything he had ever experienced. For the first time in his life, he realized that success and perfection meant nothing without the person who had shown him what it meant to truly live. In the days that followed, Julian threw himself into his work, trying to distract himself from the pain of losing Amanda. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the emptiness he felt. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, staring at the skyline he had helped create, Julian made a decision. He couldn't keep living his life for other people, for his father, for the company, for the expectations of the world. He picked up his phone and dialed Amanda's number. When she answered, her voice was hesitant. "Julian, what is it?" "I need to see you," he said, his voice firm. "Please." There was a long pause before Amanda finally said, "Okay." When they met later that night, Julian poured his heart out to Amanda. He told her about the pressure he had faced his entire life, about the sacrifices he had made to live up to his father's expectations. "But none of it matters without you," he said, his voice breaking. "You're the only person who's ever made me feel like I'm enough, just as I am. And I'm not going to let you go without a fight." Amanda's eyes filled with tears. "Julian, I don't want to lose you either. But I don't know how we can make this work." "We'll figure it out," Julian said, his voice steady. "Together." For the first time in weeks, Amanda allowed herself to hope. The weeks following Julian and Amanda's emotional reunion were anything but easy. Their decision to face the challenges together was a bold one, but the obstacles in their path only seemed to grow. Julian's relationship with his father, Richard, had reached a breaking point, and the media frenzy surrounding their connection showed no signs of slowing down. Yet for the first time in his life, Julian felt a sense of clarity. He knew what he wanted, and he was willing to fight for it. The tension between Julian and Richard had been simmering for weeks, but it finally came to a head during a high-stakes board meeting. Richard had called the meeting to discuss the future of the company, but it quickly became clear that his true intention was to pressure Julian into ending his relationship with Amanda. As the meeting began, Richard addressed the board with his usual commanding presence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "our firm has always been a symbol of excellence and integrity, but recent events have cast a shadow over our reputation. It's time we take decisive action to protect what we've built." Julian sat silently, his jaw clenched as he listened to his father's thinly veiled attack. When Richard finally turned to him, Julian knew it was time to speak up. "With all due respect, Dad," Julian said, his voice steady, "this company's reputation isn't being threatened by my personal life. It's being threatened by your inability to adapt to change." A murmur rippled through the room as the board members exchanged uneasy glances. Richard's expression darkened. "Watch your tone, Julian," he warned. "This isn't just about you. It's about the legacy of this company, our family's legacy." Julian stood, his gaze unwavering. "I've spent my entire life trying to live up to your expectations, trying to be the son you wanted me to be. But I'm done. I'm done letting you dictate my life, and I'm done sacrificing my happiness for a legacy that doesn't even feel like mine." The room fell silent as Julian's words hung in the air. For the first time, Richard looked genuinely taken aback. "If you can't accept that, then maybe it's time I step away from the company," Julian continued. "I'd rather build something of my own than spend another day living in your shadow." With that, Julian walked out of the room, leaving the board stunned, and his father speechless. While Julian was dealing with the fallout from his confrontation with Richard, Amanda was facing a challenge of her own. As part of her latest investigative piece, she had been looking into a controversial development project tied to one of Julian's competitors. The project, which involved the demolition of a historic neighborhood, had sparked outrage among local residents. Amanda's research had uncovered evidence of corruption and illegal practices, but her efforts to expose the truth had not gone unnoticed. One evening, as she was leaving her office, she noticed a black car parked across the street. The same car had been following her for days, and Amanda's unease was growing. That night, as she walked home, the car began to follow her more closely. Amanda quickened her pace, her heart pounding as she turned down a side street. Suddenly, two men stepped out of the shadows, blocking her path. "Miss Bennett," one of them said, his tone menacing, "you've been asking a lot of questions. Maybe it's time you stopped." Amanda's breath caught in her throat as the men stepped closer. She tried to back away, but they grabbed her arms, their grip tight and unyielding. "Let me go," she shouted, struggling against them. Before she could scream again, a car screeched to a halt nearby, and Julian jumped out, his expression fierce. "Get your hands off her," he shouted, charging toward them. The men hesitated for a moment before releasing Amanda and fleeing into the night. Julian pulled her into his arms, his heart racing as he held her close. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Amanda nodded, though her hands were still trembling. "How did you find me?" "I've been worried about you," Julian admitted. "When you didn't answer your phone, I came looking for you." Amanda looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, as they sat together in Julian's apartment, the weight of the evening's events finally began to sink in. Amanda leaned against Julian, her head resting on his shoulder as he held her close. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't shown up," she said softly. Julian tightened his grip on her, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I'll always be there for you, Amanda, no matter what. Amanda looked up at him, her eyes searching his. Julian, I don't want to be the reason your life falls apart. You've already sacrificed so much for me. Julian cupped her face in his hands, his gaze intense. You're not the reason my life is falling apart. You're the reason it's finally starting to make sense. For the first time, I feel like I'm living for something real, for someone real. Tears filled Amanda's eyes as Julian leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. I love you, Amanda, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, and I'm not going to let anything or anyone take you away from me. Amanda's heart swelled as she whispered back, I love you too, Julian. The next day, Julian made a bold move. He called a press conference to address the rumors and scandals that had been swirling around him and Amanda. Standing before a room full of reporters, Julian spoke with a confidence and vulnerability that left everyone in awe. I've spent my entire life trying to be perfect, he began, trying to live up to the expectations of my family, my colleagues, and the world. But perfection is an illusion. It's a prison that keeps us from living authentically. He paused, his gaze steady as he continued. Amanda Bennett is the most courageous, intelligent, and compassionate person I've ever met. She's not a distraction or a liability. She's my partner, and I'm proud to stand by her side. The room erupted in questions, but Julian remained calm, answering each one with honesty and conviction. By the end of the conference, it was clear that Julian had taken control of the narrative, refusing to let anyone dictate his life. In the weeks that followed, Julian and Amanda began to rebuild their lives together. Julian stepped down as CEO of his father's company, choosing instead to start his own firm, focused on projects that aligned with his values. Amanda continued her work as a journalist, using her platform to shine a light on important issues. Though the road ahead was still uncertain, they faced it together, their love stronger than ever. For Julian, Amanda had become his anchor, the person who reminded him that life was about more than success and perfection. And for Amanda, Julian was her safe haven, the man who had shown her that love was worth the risk. As they stood hand in hand, looking out at the skyline they had both come to call home, they knew that their story was just beginning. The chaos of the past few months had finally begun to settle. Julian and Amanda had weathered the storm together, emerging stronger and more united than ever. Their journey had been anything but easy, but it had taught them both invaluable lessons about love, courage, and the importance of staying true to oneself. Julian's decision to step down as CEO of his father's company had been met with mixed reactions. For Richard Carter, it was a bitter pill to swallow. Losing his son as the face of the company felt like a personal failure, a sign that his carefully constructed legacy was beginning to unravel. But for Julian, it was a liberation. In the weeks following his resignation, Julian threw himself into building his own architectural firm. Unlike his father's company, which focused on high-profile, profit-driven projects, Julian's new firm prioritized sustainability and community impact. His first project was a small but meaningful one, the restoration of a historic neighborhood that had been slated for demolition. Amanda often accompanied Julian to the site, watching as he worked with a passion and joy she had never seen before. "You look happy," she said one afternoon, as they stood together in the middle of the construction site. Julian turned to her, a smile spreading across his face. "I am," he admitted. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm doing something that matters not just for me, but for the people who will live here." Amanda reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm proud of you, Julian. You've come so far." Julian looked at her, his expression soft. "I couldn't have done it without you." While Julian was building his new firm, Amanda was making waves in the world of journalism. Her investigative piece on the controversial development project had been published to critical acclaim, exposing corruption and sparking a citywide conversation about the importance of preserving history and culture. The success of the article brought Amanda a newfound sense of confidence. For so long she had doubted her ability to make a difference, but now she knew that her voice mattered. One evening, as she sat at her desk, typing the final lines of her latest article, Julian walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "How's it going?" he asked, setting one of the cups down beside her. Amanda smiled, leaning back in her chair. "Almost done, just putting the finishing touches on it." Julian glanced at the screen, reading the headline aloud. "The Power of Preservation, Why Our Stories Matter." He looked at her, his eyes filled with admiration. "It's perfect." Amanda blushed, her heart swelling with pride. "Thanks. I just hope it makes a difference." Julian leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "It already has. You have." One evening, as they sat together on the balcony of Julian's apartment, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Amanda turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" she asked. Julian nodded, his gaze fixed on the skyline. "All the time. It feels like a lifetime ago that I was sitting in my office, trying to keep the world at arm's length." Amanda smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "And now?" Julian wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "Now, I can't imagine my life without you. You've changed everything, Amanda. You've changed me." Amanda looked up at him, her eyes shining with emotion. "You've changed me too, Julian. You've shown me that it's okay to let someone in, to trust, to love." For a moment they sat in silence, the weight of their journey settling over them. They had faced so many challenges, but they had faced them together, and that, more than anything, was what mattered. The following weekend, Julian and Amanda attended the grand opening of the restored neighborhood, the first project completed by Julian's new firm. The event was a celebration of community and resilience, a testament to the power of collaboration and hope. As they walked through the streets, surrounded by families and children, Amanda couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. "You did this," she said, turning to Julian. Julian shook his head, his expression humble. "We did this. None of it would have been possible without you." Amanda smiled, leaning in to kiss him. "I guess we make a pretty good team." Julian grinned, wrapping an arm around her waist. "The best." Later that evening, as the festivities wound down, Julian and Amanda found themselves standing on the rooftop of one of the newly restored buildings. The city stretched out before them, a sea of lights and possibilities. Julian turned to Amanda, his expression serious. "I know we've been through a lot, and I know the road ahead won't always be easy, but I want you to know that I'm all in. Whatever comes next, I want to face it with you." Amanda's heart swelled as she looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "I'm all in too, Julian. Wherever this journey takes us, I'm with you." As they stood together, hand in hand, the city below them alive with energy and promise, they knew that their story was far from over. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with love, hope, and the courage to embrace the unknown.